Hey there, economics kiddos. Happy Friday. 2 weeks down. Very exciting. Hopefully, we have 1 week next week and then spring break, which is spring break and it's a break. So that's pretty exciting. And then hopefully, we'll see how things go. Hopefully, we can see each other again face to face in person. So today's lesson, like I said in yesterday's lesson, I'm not going to sing today. So that's a bonus for you, probably. I don't know, unless you enjoyed my singing, which I hear I have the voice of an angel. I guess, though, that angels aren't as good of singers as we once imagined. So, regardless, let's get going, shall we? Today, I've looked over your Edpuzzle videos. I've looked over your market structure grids, looked at last Friday's sort of really brief market structure assessment. And there is a couple common threads of confusion that students are having. And so I just want to cover those today. So today's lesson is just going to be straightforward, the key takeaways to understand about market structures, a little bit of the key takeaways from factor markets, and these should answer most of the questions that you've had. So these key takeaways I've sort of established based on the feedback that I have seen through your questions, but also through the various assessments we have done. This won't take too long. And then I do have a week 2 check-in that I'd like for everyone to do. Just I'll probably do this again at the end of each week just to check in to see how you're doing in general, but also particularly with this class. So the key takeaways for market structures, I'm sorry if that was glitchy there. I had some technical difficulties, so I had to edit that. So the key takeaways for market structures, first and foremost, make sure that you have a good updated grid that you can refer to. This is usually the best way to really sort of identify the different characteristics of the 4 different market structures. And we've narrowed down the characteristics of market structures into 4. A lot of students, and part of this was because my directions may not have been overly clear, but what really helps when you make the grid is to put the 4 characteristics up here first. But this really helps when you have the characteristics up here. It helps to maintain what I call column integrity, so you can kind of see how each one of these market structures compares to each other just by sort of quickly looking. The one big takeaway: perfectly competitive markets and monopolies. They're at the extreme ends of this grid for a reason. They're the 2 extreme forms of market structures. Perfectly competitive markets don't really exist in the real world per se. Likewise, there are not a ton of monopolies, like true monopolies that have 100% market share. Most businesses are operating somewhere in between these two. So one of the biggest points of confusion for a lot of students is the idea of monopolistic competition versus monopoly, because they sound very similar. They both have the word monopoly in them. All right, so a couple things to keep in mind. Monopolistic competition is actually much closer to perfect competition than it is to a monopoly. A monopoly has one producer that has complete control of a market. It makes whatever product it wants with no substitute. The key word in monopolistic competition is not monopoly. It is not really close to a monopoly. The key word in monopolistic competition is the word competition. All right, monopolistic competition is a way closer to perfect competition than it is to monopoly. So when you think of monopolistic competition, don't let the word monopoly throw you for a loop. Hear the word competition. Monopolistic competition has many producers, just like in a perfectly competitive market. There are many producers, so there's a lot of competition. Just like in a perfectly competitive market, it's relatively easy to enter a monopolistically competitive market. The example I used was like making t-shirts. There's a market out there for what are called novelty t-shirts, t-shirts that have funny little slogans and stuff on them. And in general, if you wanted to enter that market, it would be relatively easy. Not super easy. You would still need to buy lots of like cheap generic t-shirts and then find a way to apply fun little messages, whether it's through iron-on or some other more advanced techniques, but it's relatively easy. There is a lot of competition because there are so many producers. Again, just like a perfectly competitive market, lots of competition. The only difference, and it is a big difference, but the only difference between monopolistically competitive markets and perfectly competitive markets is that in monopolistically competitive markets, all of these firms produce what we call heterogeneous products, meaning they produce differentiated products. In a perfectly competitive market, every product that every producer produces is identical. So again, if you think about agriculture, every ear of corn or every ear of sweet corn a farmer produces, whether it's a farmer here in Ashland County, a farmer in Crawford County, a farmer in Richland County, those are all the corn is pretty much the same. All right, it's a homogeneous product. In a monopolistically competitive market, there are tons of producers, but they are producing differentiated products. So if you think of novelty t-shirts, even though t-shirts are very, very similar, each t-shirt company has a little bit of a different slogan, a little different design, so they're not 100% identical with each other. Because of that, there is what we call non-price competition in a monopolistically competitive market. And what that means is that because products are a little bit different from each other, firms will try to maintain and get more people to buy their product by differentiating and advertising and trying to distinguish their product from their competitors. In perfectly competitive markets, that doesn't happen. In a perfectly competitive market, you don't see, every individual farmer running commercials asking you to buy that particular farmer's corn because it doesn't make sense. Their corn is no different than their neighbor's corn or the farmer's corn in the next county. So they aren't going to try to say, hey, my corn's better than their corn. It doesn't work that way. But in a monopolistically competitive market, when there is product differentiation, there is that non-price competition. Think of it in terms of like Nike shoes. All right, Nike makes a shoe that looks similar, but it's not identical to an Adidas or to a Reebok or to a Brooks or to an Under Armour. So they advertise and they try to make their shoes a little bit different in a way that consumers are going to want to buy. In other words, they're trying to make a little mini monopoly. They're trying to have it so that there are people that will buy their shoe and only their shoe. And there are people in this world who are going to buy Nike shoes only. Because of that, they have a little mini monopoly. So when you think of monopolistically competitive markets, you're thinking of many different producers that are producing similar products, but each one is trying to get a little mini monopoly, not dominate the entire market, but get a little mini monopoly in the markets. There's still competition that's still going to keep the price of products a little bit lower than a truly monopolistic market. But again, the reason we call it monopolistic competition, the key is competition. That's the key word. It's much closer to perfect competition, but all these producers are trying to get a little mini monopoly in their particular field. Whereas a monopoly is a very different. In a monopoly, there is, I should say, one producer, not one produce. There is one producer, and there is no substitute for that producer's good. It would be like if instead of having, tons of different shoe companies, it'd be like, well, if there was only one shoe that the government says, Mr. Court, I'm going to let you have a monopoly, and you're going to be the only person allowed to make and sell shoes. I would have a shoe monopoly, Mr. Court shoes, and nobody else would be allowed to sell shoes but me. That is a monopoly. All right. And you could have any shoe you want as long as it's a Mr. Court shoe. And you can have any style you want as long as it's a style that Mr. Court produces. You see how different that is than what we're used to, where there's a lot of different types of shoes and you can choose which shoes you want. There's more competition in a monopolistically competitive market. In a monopoly, there is no competition. Because of that, there is what we call a more inelastic demand, meaning that people, if there is a monopoly in a product, like if there was only one shoe company, people are going to have to buy from that shoe company. So regardless of what that shoe company charges, they're going to have to pay essentially the price for that shoe. In general, in theory, it is impossible to enter a monopoly market. All right. And the reason is the monopoly has so much power over a product's price that if someone does try to enter the market, a monopoly can just lower their prices temporarily, drive that person out of business or that other firm out of business, and then raise their prices again. So monopolies have almost complete control on a market and can prevent any other firms from entering and exiting. The only similarity between monopolistically competitive markets and monopolies is that in the theory of the firm, they both have what are called downward sloping demand curves. And I'll show you that here in a second. That's really the only similarity. They both have a little, and what that means is they have a little bit of control over the price. So a monopoly has a significant amount of control over a product's price. Monopolistically competitive market, each firm has a little bit of power over their pricing. In terms of oligopolies, some people said that you're a little confused on oligopolies. I don't really need you to know a lot about oligopolies. So all I need you to know is essentially what is in the market structures grid. An oligopoly is any market where there are like 2 to 4, 2 to 5 producers that control the market. Think of soft drinks. Like there's really 2 main producers that control a majority, well over 60% of the soft drink market, and that's Coke and Pepsi. And I know when you walk down the grocery store aisles, you see a lot of other soft drinks, but if you peel back the layers a little bit, almost every one of those drinks is owned either by Coca-Cola Incorporated or Pepsi Company Incorporated. So that's an oligopoly when there's only a handful of producers that really dominate the entire market. Monopolies or oligopolies can lead to what we call monopolistic practices. So what that means is that oligopolies in America, this is illegal to do. We do not believe in monopolies, and I'll show you why here in a second. Um, Oligopolies, if they work together, we call that collusion. So if Coke or Pepsi were to work together to fix prices or set prices, they would essentially be acting like a monopoly at that point. So collusion is when oligopolies work together to set prices and fix prices. Price fixing is illegal in America. A cartel is something similar to oligopolies who merge together to sort of dominate and set prices for products. In theory, if you read your book, in theory it says that oligopolies lead to more stable prices. Um, in general, there's not a lot of real world from what I have read and researched to really back that up. This was something that I remember my econ professor, he taught us some of the fundamentals of oligopolies. They have what's called in theory a kinked demand curve, which is kind of interesting sounding. It sounds like, kinked, sounds like kinky and ooh, how risque. But regardless, there's not a lot of real world data to really back up some of the fundamental economic concepts that are taught about oligopolies. If you end up going into economics in college or take it for CCP next year, you might learn a little bit more about it. But again, all you need to know in this class, it has few producers, and sometimes, if left unchecked, oligopolies will work together to fix prices through what we call collusion, and that's a bad thing. So a couple other key takeaways that to know about markets. A perfectly competitive market is the ideal market structure, and it maximizes resource allocation. The reason being is that supply and demand, the product's price and the product's quantity is set by supply and demand. It also maximizes what we call consumer and producer surplus. So again, you have a demand curve for products in a perfectly competitive market, you have a supply curve for products in a perfectly competitive market. And where these two intersect, we have equilibrium. That determines our product's price, and that determines the quantity being produced. Yesterday, I got a little bit sloppy explaining demand and supply in ways that I was sort of jumping over a lot of content. But again, demand represents the willingness of consumers to consume products. And they consume products because they are wanting to maximize their utility. The supply is the producer's willingness to produce. And again, producers, one of the big things that they have to do when they produce products is buy factors of production. And so on the factor market, producers buy the factors of production at a price that households are willing to sell it to them for. So the supply curve also represents the price that society is willing to give its resources to firms in order to make goods and services. So when this point happens right here, we're optimizing resource allocation. And again, you see an optimization of consumer surplus and producer surplus. All non-perfectly competitive markets are what we call imperfectly competitive. So monopolistic competition, oligopoly, monopoly, these are imperfectly competitive markets. And at some level, they do not allocate, they do not maximize resource allocation. It's a bit of a typo there. And the reason is that firms are always going to produce where they maximize profits, where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. One thing I do want to reiterate, though, is that even though firms in imperfectly competitive markets are going to operate at a profit maximization point instead of where supply equals demand, demand and supply are still very important in determining the price and quantity of a product. So in any market that is not a perfectly competitive market, you will get this downward sloping demand curve because, again, in a non-perfectly competitive market, firms are what we call price makers. They can adjust prices to an extent. Because a firm has a downward sloping demand curve, their marginal revenue curve is going to be less than demand. Now, I did a lesson about this. If you don't understand that, don't worry about it. I'm not going to have you do the math behind it. All you need to know is that in an imperfectly competitive market, they have a graph that looks like this. When I say they, firms have graphs that look like this. They have a demand curve that's downward sloping and a marginal revenue curve that is less than demand. And a firm maximizes profits where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. All right, and that is the quantity that the firm is going to choose to produce at, because every point beyond this profit maximization point, each additional product, in other words, the marginal cost, each additional product is going to cost a firm more to produce than it's going to give them in revenue. So they are not going to produce more than this point. And because of that, you find a firm will create this quantity to maximize profits. To know the price of the product at this quantity, the demand curves tells us how much consumers are willing to pay for this quantity of product, and that then will give us the price of that will be charged on the market for this product. All right, so again, that's how monopolies work, or I should say any firm that is not perfectly competitive, that's how they set their prices. In a perfectly competitive market, we would normally be operating right here where the demand curve intersects the supply curve. And for the sake of this class, the marginal cost curve is going to be pretty much the same thing as the supply curve. So in a perfectly competitive market, instead of I should say our equilibrium would be right here, and we would have a higher quantity being produced, and we'd be having, as a society, the price of this product would be lower. All right, so an imperfectly competitive market leads to higher prices, it leads to a lower quantity of resources being produced, and it also causes all of this dead weight loss. Now, I do want to show that just because firms are going to operate where marginal cost equals marginal revenue, demand and changes in demand still affect price and quantity, just like we had studied in a perfectly competitive market. So let's take this exact same curve as before, and I'm going to set a new demand curve. So let's say the demand for this product in this monopoly, this market structure of monopoly, this demand increases. All right, so what's going to happen, I'm going to keep the old price and the old quantity here. I'm also going to keep this old demand curve there because it's attached to the screen. I can't get rid of it. But anyway, with this new demand curve, we're going to get a new marginal revenue curve. And that new marginal revenue curve is going to give us a new marginal revenue, I should say a new profit maximization point, a new point where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. All right, so here is our new profit maximization point after demand increased. And so this again is going to tell us the quantity that this monopolist is now going to produce at. So as demand increased, the quantity produced increased, just like we had studied in perfect competition. And again, at this quantity, to find out the market price, we find out where it intersects the demand curve, because demand is telling us how much consumers are willing to pay at a given quantity. All right. And at this point, this is the price, or at this is the quantity demanded point on the demand curve, which tells us that at this quantity, consumers are going to be willing to pay this price. So as demand increased, just like in the perfectly competitive market, quantity went up and price went up. So when I say monopolies have a lot of power to influence the price, they still have to sort of obey the laws of demand and supply. All right, so when demand goes up, demand goes down, their prices are going to go up and down as well, just not quite to the same level that they would in a perfectly competitive market. And then finally, the last thing to go over, factor markets from yesterday. I got a little sloppy in the video after I sang my song. I was a little bit worked up, I think, and I was sort of stumbling and bumbling through a couple things. Factor markets operate very similar to product markets. There is still going to be demand and supply, and equilibrium is where demand equals supply. One thing I was doing a really bad job at yesterday was the idea I kept saying the price of labor, price of land, price of capital. That sort of made things a little bit confusing. When we talk about the factor markets, I'll show you this in a second. When we talk about the price of labor, we call that a wage. So sometimes a salary, depending on the job or the occupation. When we talk about land, instead of saying price, we use the word rent. When we talk about capital, instead of saying price, we use the word income. I kept saying price yesterday, and I was upset when I listened to my video. So as a reminder, we have been studying a lot of the product market where firms make goods and services and households consume goods and services and pay money in exchange. The factor market happens at the opposite end of the flow chart. In the factor market, households are going to provide land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship, and firms are going to consume or use those. Consume is probably not the best term to use. They are using the factors of productions to make goods and services. And then they pay for those factors of production in what we call the factor market. And just like in a product market, you have a demand for factors of production. So there is a demand for my labor, there is a demand for your labor. And the more a firm has to pay for your labor, the less willing they are to buy that labor because it costs them a lot of money. Likewise, the more that somebody is willing to pay for my labor or for your labor, the more willing we're going to be willing to supply our labor because we want all that money. All right, so just as a reminder then, and I want to make sure I hit this pretty well. When we're talking about the factor of labor, instead of saying price, we use the term wage. So the demand for labor and the supply of labor will reach equilibrium, and that equilibrium will establish the wage that someone earns on the market, or salary, depending on the occupation. All right, when we're talking about land, instead of saying the price of land, we usually use the term rent. And when we talk about capital, instead of saying the price of capital, we typically say interest. There's a demand for capital, a supply for capital, and where equilibrium is set, there is an interest that we pay for capital. So yeah, I'm not going to make you know those three things in general. I just felt like yesterday's lesson was a little sloppy. I kept saying price of labor when I should have just been saying wage the whole time. The key difference to factor markets between factor markets and product markets. In a factor market, it is the households that supply and it is the firms that demand. And in a factor market, demand is what we call derived, meaning the demand for factors of production is dependent on the demand for the goods and services that those factors are being used to create in the product market. All right, so in other words, just sort of go over this. In the product market, it is the households that demand goods and services, and it is the firms or businesses that supply goods and services. That's going to be backwards up here in the factor market. In the factor market, it is the businesses that are demanding resources. The businesses, they want to consume the factors of production, and it is the households who are supplying the factors of production. So the last thing I wanted to just reiterate is the idea of demand in the factor market. And this is important. This is a real world application for when you're going out and trying to sell your labor, get a good wage, get a good salary. The demand for your wage, or I should say the demand for your labor, the demand for your entrepreneurial abilities, it is derived from the product market. It is derived, the higher in demand the product is going to be that a business is using your labor to make, the higher in demand your particular labor is going to be. So for example, right now, there's a huge demand for healthcare because of the coronavirus, a huge demand there are people who are sick and they're going to hospitals. They are demanding healthcare. Um, because demand is so high for healthcare right now, so many people want to consume and need to consume healthcare, the demand for nurses and doctors is super high right now. On the flip side, like if I wanted to make a new company and sell, Mr. Court t-shirts, and all they are a lot of t-shirts with my big fat ugly face on them. All right, there's not a huge demand for Mr. Court t-shirts. And because of that, there isn't like a big demand for the capital I would need to make these t-shirts, which would be like pictures of my face. This is like a really stupid example, but like a picture of my face to put on a t-shirt. There's no big demand for that. So if I had, a picture of me and I called up a t-shirt designer and said, hey, I have these pictures of my face. I'll sell them to you so you can put them on t-shirts. They'll say, okay, we'll pay you like nothing for it because there's no demand in the product market. No one wants to buy that. So there's no demand for pictures of me in the factor market. So hopefully that clears a couple things up. I'm going to go ahead and change up our notes a little bit online so that you can access these Google Notes, these Google Slide notes to look them over. So again, long story short, just remember monopolistic competition is much similar to perfect competition. The only difference is that monopolistically competitive markets produce heterogeneous products and they use non-price competition. Oligopolies, all you really need to know, there's a few producers, and if they're left unchecked, they can fix prices and act like monopolies, and that's illegal. Perfectly competitive markets is the ideal market. It maximizes resource allocation. It's sort of like it's what we think would be, economists say, is the best way to allocate resources. Anything that's not perfectly competitive is not going to allocate resources efficiently. In general, anything that is not perfectly competitive will lead to higher prices and less quantity. And then finally, factor markets are very similar to product markets, just the big difference, demand and supply is switched up a little bit, and demand in a factor market is a derived demand, meaning that the demand in the factor market is dependent upon the demand for the product that those factors are going to be used to create in the product market. All right, so the last thing I want you guys to do, I do have a pretty brief week 2 check-in, and it's generally speaking, it's just sort of how well do you feel you understand the what we've been going over. In general, how is the class going? And then finally, anything that you would like to, any comments you'd like to make, anything you'd like to see me do better. And yeah, all right, everyone, I will talk to you later. Bye.